China is committing some of the world's most worst human rights abuses. But what about America? America has done the most worst human rights abuses too. That's always the argument of this whataboutism or whataboutery. So the reason why I came to open this up is because the Winter Olympics in Beijing is here, and it's already past the anniversary of the January 6th attack in the U.S. Capitol. And there's actually a lot to address here because with this thing called American exceptionalism, and one of the worst things about American exceptionalism when it comes to human rights is it singles out the US as if like the United States does not have any human rights abuses. And combine communist China and the US, or combine the human rights abuses from the colonial powers in the 18th, 19th century, all the way to China, Russia in the Cold War, and not to forget Nazi Germany in World War II. It kind of seems to be like the U.S. is almost surpassing all these countries combined when it comes to human rights. If you look at the list of the history of the human rights abuses committed by the U.S., like the genocide of the Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, the onslaughtering of the Midwestern Native Americans, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment camps of the Japanese Americans, and the list goes on. And this is something, this is something that the so-called Western chauvinists want us to ignore, because they say that, oh, if we take down this statues, which these statues represented racism, which is what's going on right now with removing the statues that represented the genocide and racism. And I'm not gonna name you all, but and now these so-called jingoist American chauvinists are going ballistic and outraged that they're taking down the American heritage, which supposedly those statues represented the painful acts of racism. And so that's actually one of the reasons is in the wake of the George Floyd killing and the mass protests, it kind of crossed my mind, or kind of crossed people's minds, is we need to question America's stance on human rights, especially how it calls some of the rest of the world it does not like over the same human rights abuses that the US is committing. So, and it's kind of ironic that like these people who went out and supported the police to crush the peaceful protesters in summer of 2020, and most of these people took part in the insurrection that occurred last year. And it's ironic that they were like, we back the blue, we love the police, and then seconds later, they started yelling at them, throw defamatory words like, you're traitors, you betrayed the Constitution, and then they start throwing punches. So, where was the thing called Blue Lives Matter when the Blue Lives needed help when the rioters, started attacking the US Capitol? And they were like, yeah, we backed the blue when they were the ones crushing the peaceful protests, contrary months before the insurrection. So, one of the things that I think it comes to question is that pundits and shills within the CCP or Chinese Communist Party are pinpointing a narrative that America keeps attacking China for its human rights abuses, the same thing that China accuses the US of when they say that China is committing a genocide or China is imprisoning dissidents. And then the pundits are like, yeah, look at you, America. You got the worst mass incarceration rates. You got the police crushing down protesters very violently, like a military move. And the list goes on. And the unnecessary aggression in the Middle East, the funding of a foreign country to fuel another war that led to mass starvations, which I'm talking about Yemen. So the question is how can the U.S. call out countries that they don't like over the same human rights abuses? Yeah, that's the thing. Now, going over in China, since Biden said he will not invite any politician to attend the Olympics, this might also backfire because this will give China the excuse to say they will not invite delegates to attend the Los Angeles Olympics because the US is doing the same human rights abuses that it accuses China of. And that's what the boycott was about. The abuses in Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the list goes on. I don't think that sports should be used for any political tool because sports should be something that people can come together and then start making loud cheering noises. But of course, international sports have been rigged by activists. There wasn't that much outrage when there were like even though that there was outrage and Qatar was able to fix it, but there wasn't that much of an outrage of a boycott or whatever when Qatar was building stadiums in the backs of the harsh labor conditions of the overseas workers from other countries who helped build the stadiums, which, speaking about that, the FIFA World Cup this year is going to be in Qatar. But they were able to implement some conditions from reports that I've read. But we're not calling out other countries over the same human rights abuses, like China commits human rights abuses. Like, I'm not saying that China is good or bad, but I'm saying that it's kind of unfair that China gets the spotlight of the human rights abuses than countries and then other authoritarian countries or even in the US. So why is it that China always gets the spotlight of human rights abuses or boycotts? That's because China is a growing country and a lot of companies are moving there. And their One Belt Road initiative would be a way to make China the next superpower. And that's why they're doing everything they can to take down China, using activists too, whether if it's in the US, Europe, or Canada, or in Australia. They're using these people so that they can, get picking on China unfairly. I'm not saying that, it's justifiable, but I'm just saying to you that, like, even in the boycott in Tibet, the boycott of the Beijing Summer Olympics that was held in 2008, and there were attempts to boycott the Beijing Olympics because, the same human rights abuses that the Biden said he will not invite politicians to attend the Winter Olympics for the same human rights abuses. Just like the very famous, Free Tibet movement were the loudest in calling for the boycott of the Beijing Summer Olympics back in '08. And so there and this is just going to give the green light that they're going to call out China might call other countries to boycott the LA Olympics because the unjust and unfair, unnecessary or unlawful shootings of unarmed civilians by police officers, the mass incarcerations, the locking up migrants in cages, and there's a whole list of human rights abuses that countries where the US is hostile to, is gonna call them out. And I think that we need to do something with addressing more of the human rights abuses in our country, because the more we keep ignoring it, it gives the excuse of authoritarian countries the US is criticizing, the green light to keep committing more crimes. And so that's one thing that you should also consider, is that when the US pulled out in Afghanistan, and they were kind of like this outrage that we're doing negotiations with the Taliban, America's enemies. And they were like, why are you negotiating with, bullies? Of course, America always, befriends bullies. Look at Saudi Arabia, for instance. Worst human rights abuses, the violation of women's rights, and, the Saudi-led war in Yemen, fully backed by the US. And yet we're not making this outrage that, we're accusing, Afghanistan, or the outrage that we're negotiating with the police. Of course. We should, and there's this, certain excuse that, the we shouldn't conduct business in countries like Cuba, a country that, has been sanctioned by the US for over 6 decades. And it's like we cannot do business with them because they commit human rights. This is the same hypocrisy. Like, America, since in the Cold War, was establishing authoritarian dictators, especially like in South America with the right-wing government in Colombia, Pinochet in Chile. And these are countries that we had no problem with, and they had some of the worst human rights abuses. And so it seems like now, since, the incident with, the unjust killings of, unarmed innocent black civilians by white cops, it seems to be like, and then the establishment of Juneteenth, which is like the Emancipation Day in after that would lead to the abolition of slavery in the 1860s, that would lead to the Civil War. And then here are these, revisionist historians, like, they're destroying our history, they are, destroying America's heritage, and the list goes on. But for me, I think it's just a wake-up call that I think it's time that we need to start learning the real, true America's history. And so we need to keep, it's very important, while it is okay to call out other authoritarian countries committing the same human rights abuses, but need the reminder that we need to pay importance of our painful history and acknowledge the human rights abuses we're committing, because if we keep neglecting these things, if we don't pay importance to it, it will give other tyrannical governments all the excuse, especially those that the US accuses of human rights violations, to keep committing more atrocities, to keep committing more crimes, because democracies, even in the US, does the same thing. So that's all I have to say about, you know, the United States human rights hypocrisy. And, you know, I think it's also good that we're calling out on what's going on right now in the January 6th committee, because, you know, of what happened with Trump inciting the insurrection, almost killed, that was almost like a coup. And right now, it's already 1 year since, the violent military coup in Myanmar. And I have friends in Myanmar who are, going out to, you know, fight for democracy and freedom. And then here you got another seditionist, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who suggested that maybe what happened in Myanmar should happen in the US, when someone asked him that how come what happened in Myanmar can't happen in the US, and everybody was cheering. And it kind of disturbs me that, being that I have Burmese friends who are out there in the streets trying to protest for human rights, and then you got some seditionists who are like here in the US who are like, we should do that. Maybe it should happen here. So, you know, just, keep yourself aware, make read some, you know, America's real history, and I'll see you in my next video.